Well, in our last theology, we just got started on polytheism, and make a few comments here. In addition to what Schaeffer has to say about it, he defines it for us, basically, and that's just about the only thing he actually says about it, except to point out in his criticism of it that it is a belief system that is based on nature and is contrary to the scriptures. It's contrary to biblical history. It trades an infinitely perfect God for many limited gods. And he says it includes nature worship. And there's absolutely almost no similarity to true biblical theism. Let me expand on that just a little bit by giving you a few descriptive statements about polytheism. When you have a belief in many gods, one of them has to be first, right? And some of them have to be lesser. And so you can either make lesser gods subordinate to a supreme God, to one supreme God, or you can make your lesser gods subordinate to an idea or force, or you can make your lesser gods subordinate to a dominant God. Polytheism. Okay. This is kind of important because depending on where you go in the world, if you become a missionary, you'll have to learn about this. Missionaries go to the Far East and to South America, to Africa. They run into peoples that believe in many gods, and categorically, each of these views will fall into one of these categories, just by the nature of the case. Right? And even today, I was reading yesterday in a book that I've got on the Old Testament, on Hebrew words in the Old Testament. And even to this very day, Christian missionaries working in China are divided over the name for God they should use. Simply because in Chinese religious experience there are all kinds of gods. It's a polytheistic culture. And therefore, when you're going to pick, if you're translating the scripture into Chinese, some dialect, you have to pick a name for God that is not going to leave. You can't pick a name for a lesser God. There's just no way you can do it. But you have to be careful. If you pick a name for a dominant or supreme God, what is the associated ideas with that? So polytheism is very practical. You have to understand, basically, the nature of it. Generally speaking, polytheism includes, in addition to lesser and greater gods, a belief in good or bad forces or spirits or powers, however you wish to call them, that are generally unnamed. They either have never been given a name, or they are not definable to the point where they can be identified very explicitly. They're either unnamed or conceptually indefinite. The gods of polytheism generally take many forms. This is obvious. This is theology. We're discussing polytheism as one of the anti-theistic theories this morning. We started on time today. Actually, we're 5 minutes late. What time do you have? Oh, I've got 27 after. 20 after? What we're going to have to do is get our clocks together here.
You get a whole family. I guess 26 and a half after.
In the last two classes, by the way, which you missed, Chris, we discussed materialism and evolutionism. And that's what's on the other tapes if you want to catch up on them.
And Tracy's tape is there.
Right. Polytheism, Schaeffer defines it for us, and we've just kind of gone through and given a few more descriptions of it. Polytheists believe in lesser gods or greater gods, lesser gods that are subordinate to great ideas. And by the way, an example of this would be Hinduism, that Krishna and Vishnu and all their different thousands and thousands of gods are, some of them are greater than other gods. Right? An example of a god subordinate to an idea would be in Buddhism. And an example of lesser gods subordinate to a dominant god. What was the dominant god of the Greeks? Do you remember? Remember your Greek mythology? Zeus, right. Zeus is the dominant god, but I mean then you have all your lesser gods in Greek mythology. Okay. All right? And so the Greeks were polytheistic. In addition to believing in good, lesser and greater gods, polytheists very often believe in a variety of forces and spirits, generally unnamed, but they believe in them. Their gods take many forms. A common threefold breakdown of nature deities. They have gods of nature, by the way, and they have gods of society. And a common threefold breakdown of the gods of nature would be celestial gods, terrestrial gods, that has having to do with the earth, and atmospheric gods. Celestial, terrestrial, and atmospheric gods. No, this is some Englishman's classification. Like if you want an example of it, in Indo-Aryan religion, the god of the sun is called Surya. Right, so there's the celestial. The god of rain and battle, which has to do with the earth, is Indra. Well, I suppose that would have, I don't know whether that would be terrestrial or atmospheric. And then the god of fire is Agni, in that particular example. But the gods take many forms. In addition to this, you could point out that sometimes gods take the forms of plants or animals. Look at the Maya and the Incan cultures, right? The gods took the forms of animals and plants. Even physical phenomena such as mountains and rivers can take on deity or divine qualities. Can you think of an example? Okay, to the Egyptians, there was a god of the Nile, right? To this very day, the river Ganges in India is considered actually a god, right? Mount Olympus in Greece, right? right? It was considered to be the abode of the holy gods, right? So physical phenomena or things actually in the earth besides plants and animals, even social functions are associated with divine qualities. For instance, the God of death, the God of judgment, and the God of war, and the God of love. Right? These are functions. Loving, warring, dying, judging, and so forth. There's social functions having to do with people's interrelationships. Right? And so gods will take those forms. And they add, not insignificantly, that man himself even becomes deified in polytheistic religions. They all have to do with the forms of God. These are a general threefold classification that you can use to put all the various forms of the gods. For instance, these ones here have to do with, all this stuff has to do with this one here, the terrestrial. They all have to do with Earth. Right?
Society and nature are both from the same level.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that, yeah. Under man, look at Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. Now, they were polytheistic, right? The Babylonians and the king considered himself to be a god. Right? The Romans practiced this. The Chinese practiced this. The kings ruled by divine right. They became little gods. The king of Tyre, the king of Sidon. All right? That's right. Even as late as the Second World War in Japan. Yeah. Emperor worship. All right? So polytheism, there's a description of polytheism. And as we concluded last class, if I was going to say any three things against polytheism, that is, what is wrong with polytheism, I would say that number one, it's most natural to believe in the top God rather than all the little gods. And if you're going to believe in a God, why not just believe in the most powerful one? How about the God of gods, King of kings and Lord of lords? Right? That's to me, it seems like a sensible argument. Something that's overlooked. Secondly, as Chafer points out, this polytheism is directly contrary to Scripture. And I realize that, a Hindu or a Buddhist isn't going to accept the biblical Scriptures, except to point out that the Vedic Scriptures of the Hindus and the Chinese Scriptures, of the writings of Buddha and Confucius and all these men, none of them have the historical, the prophetic credibility of the ancient Hebrew Scriptures. And even today in the Western world, humanists, people that aren't themselves Christians, will hold the Bible up as the most credible, the most accurate, the most recognized of all ancient literature. It's in a class by itself. And so the religion then, the belief systems that are based on the Bible make more sense. It's more reasonable to base it on a holy book like the Bible than to follow a belief system based on something as absurd as and contradictory as and inconsistent as all these other ones. Unrealistic. So the Bible is the most credible of all ancient religious books, and we are convinced from bibliology that Christianity has to be right. Monotheism, not polytheism. The Scriptures teach monotheism through Christ. Right? And a third thing is that all of this stuff, look at to make a plant god or an animal god or to make a man into God, or to make something that people do into God, or to make some physical feature of the world into a God, or to give them divine qualities, is really worshiping the creation. It's confusing the creation with the Creator. And that's Paul's point in Romans chapter 1. The fundamental problem of polytheism is that it confuses the creation with the Creator. And virtually all of these other polytheistic religions, virtually all, if I have it right, are creationist. They believe in creators, but they worship the creation instead of the Creator. See, these are three fundamental objections against polytheism. Let's move on to the next one, and that is idealism. First, do you have any questions or problems with anything that you read and Chafer on that? Now is the time to bring it up and discuss it in class while we're on it, because we aren't going to touch on it again. I'm sorry? Officially, Roman Catholicism is monotheistic, practically speaking, because it's a syncretic religion. That is, that it adds to its teachings just to gain supremacy over people groups. It'll allow them to keep their own religion, whether it be a polytheistic religion or not, as long as they will accept Mary. That's the main thing for Catholicism. So yes, depends on where you go. In South America, Roman Catholicism is polytheistic, right? In Canada, it's basically monotheistic. In the Indian cultures in Canada, it's polytheistic, right? Let's move on to idealism and realism as two antitheistic philosophies. All that Chafer does in his brief presentation of these two is to give you a definition and a one-statement description. What is idealism? This is really complex stuff. I'd like to try to simplify it in class today. What is idealism? What do you think it is? Yes, now they both have to do with what a person thinks. You have to specify what is it about thinking, human thinking, that idealism teaches. They both try to make sense of everything. Okay, the answer or reality is in the mind. The ontological argument was stated by Anselm in the 11th century. Don't write this down, right? The ontological argument was originated by Anselm in the 11th century, and he was an idealist. That is, he said that the very fact that we could perceive in our minds, that we think about a perfect God, argues for the existence of, that is, the reality of, a God who is like that. Because if he is not perfect, then he is not God. If he doesn't exist, then he's not perfect, and therefore he can't be God. It's kind of like a really involved argument, but that's the idea. Reality exists in the mind, right? Reality exists when the mind perceives perceives it. So to an idealist, is there such a thing as, could you conceive in your chair this morning something in your mind that isn't in this room? Give me an example. Okay, there's no television in this room, but Brian is thinking of a television, right? It exists in his mind. He perceives that there is such a thing as a television. Are televisions real? So far as we know, they're real. Okay, can you give me an example? Another example. Chris, think of something that's not in this room. Okay, Blair's truck. What do you think of that?
I thought of it and you right away. I better keep my voice shut. I was thinking of something future.
Okay, how about a flying carpet? I can conceive this morning in my mind's eye of such a thing as a flying carpet. Now here you begin to see the limitations of the idealistic philosophy. Just because the mind perceives something, it can imagine something, does that make it real? Does that actually make it reality? Britannica defines idealism this way. In philosophy, it's the teaching that emphasizes the primacy of spirit or consciousness in viewing the world. Now, there are 2 or 3 basic points that idealism made. Don't necessarily write them down unless you really like these. Abstract relations between entities are more real than the objects apprehended through the senses. In other words, there is a piece of chalk in my hand, and there is a hand holding the chalk here. Now, the interrelationship between the chalk and the hand is more real to an idealist than the fact that my fingers feel and that my eyes see chalk and hand. It's the relationship that's real. Like, why does chalk exist? What is hand doing with chalk? Right? It's the spiritual, it's the non-material interrelationship that is the reality of this situation. Existence to an idealist is primarily in the realm of ideas. That is, the reality of objects resides in their perceptibility. Something is only real if you can perceive it. That's what we read. Reality exists when the mind perceives something. Right? There's a flaw in that. Right.
That's hard to do from said that.
Well, here's a question here's a little puzzle that you've probably heard before. All right? We're all sitting in this room and we're not out in the forest, right? If a tree falls in the forest while we're sitting in this room, does it make any noise? To an idealist, we can perceive the reality of a tree falling in the forest and making noise. So we would say yes. The answer to that riddle is yes, to an idealist. To a realist, he would say, well, that depends on whether no, you have to be there. It has to actually happen or it's not real. I mean, you can't just perceive it. Yeah. Right? Now, we both, like the person that's sitting in the classroom like we are, through human experience, we know from having had past experience with our senses that when a tree does fall, has everybody in this room seen a tree fall down? Whether it was man, done on purpose or accidental, sure. We've all seen a tree fall, and therefore we all know from past experience that when trees fall, they make noise. Right? So an idealist doesn't depend on that. He says that if your mind conceives it, it's real. Right? A realist takes the other side. A realist says that the conception of an object through sensory perception or cognition in general is real in their own right, and they exist independently of their being known or related to the mind. Right? So there is a tree out there and it's real. Right? I can't think back on an experience where I've actually sensed God with my senses. I've never seen him, never felt him, touched him, tasted him, heard him with my actual eardrums. Right? But I believe he's real. That's the idealist. Right? Now there's an element of truth in both of them, can't you see? Yeah. Well, okay, let's go back to Schaeffer and just summarize what he said. Basically, he defined both of them. He said idealism is a system of reflective thinking interpreting the universe as a progressive evolution of an ideal. That is, nothing exists except in thought or impression of the mind. Now, when they say nothing exists, that's an all-inclusive statement that makes it false. Idealism in itself as a philosophy is a false philosophy. If I could make two criticisms of it. First, idealism is inadequate. It is inadequate. It is lacking because it denies that well, I don't know if it denies anything. It accepts God's existence, but it makes, I think the more serious thing that I would say about idealism is that it makes human perception the ground of truth. It makes human perception the ground of reality or truth. It disregards or is not concerned with divine revelation. That is the primary problem with idealistic philosophy. I hope you understand that much. Let me give you an example. There are all kinds of idealists. There are formalistic, transcendental, subjective, objective, aesthetic, moral, dialectical, absolute, metaphysical, epistemological idealists. Just on go the types and strands of idealism. For example, there's an important guy that lived in the 1800s. His name was Hegel. Now, Hegel's a very interesting guy. I never realized until I was reading through some of this stuff. He believed in dialectical idealism, which became known as absolute idealism. He said that reality can be known and is ultimately spiritual. Sounds good. Reality can be known. In other words, we can know what is real. And everything that is real is essentially spiritual in nature. Don't you believe that? Don't you believe that the devil is real and that he's essentially a spiritual being? Don't you believe that God is real? Don't you believe that people are real? Don't you believe that the material things in this world are real and they originally have a spiritual origin? Creation by God. Sure, Christians believe that. Secondly, Hegel went on to say, spirit or mind, quote unquote, can only realize itself in relation to the external world. He went on to say that the only way you can really know something is through the physical world in which we live. So he went one step further to what, like, these guys all disagree with themselves. Right? Can't say all idealists are the same. Right? But Hegel said that you come to a reality of the spiritual reality. You come to an understanding of spiritual reality through the physical world. That makes sense to me because the cosmological, the teleological, the anthropological arguments, which we've already been discussing in theology so far, are based on the real world. right? The actual world in which we live, we look at that, and using our reason, we come to an understanding of the spiritual nature of God. It exists. He's a person. He's intelligent. He's powerful, right? We come to a spiritual conception of God, and as far as we're concerned, that's realistic. That's true. He does, in reality, exist. Well, Hegel went on to explain that and I touched on this last class, and I didn't do a very good job on it, so I'm going to touch on it again. This is part of his philosophy of idealism. That in our mind, in our minds, we have thoughts. Thought A, we would call a thesis, and then as we grow in knowledge and experience and so forth, we get thought B, which is you could call an antithesis. It's the opposite of thought A. There's a conflict. There's inconsistency between these things. Haven't you ever experienced this? 3 or 4 weeks ago, Danny in church came up to me afterwards and he said, "But I always thought that," and we had a long discussion about the meaning of Christ's death on the cross. He had thought this, and then something I said is an antithesis to what he had thought. And so therefore he came away with a revised view, or a revised understanding of that particular thought. And this is point C, and this is called a dialectic, a change where two different things produce a third different understanding that is different than either one of the previous ones, or combines elements of the other two. Right? Now, Danny's knowledge of what happened on the cross may someday be challenged by something else that stands in contradiction to what we've all experienced this sort of thing. We do it every day in class. You hear something you've never heard before that stands in opposition to something you've always considered to be true, or to the best of your knowledge. And so we are constantly, our thinking is evolving, and this is what he calls absolute idealism, Hegel. The only problem with it was that Charles Darwin comes along, not 100 years or 75 years later, I don't forget exactly, and he takes this concept of the dialectic that Hegel was talking about human knowledge and perception and mind, and he applies it to the physical world. He says that's the mechanism whereby the world came into existence. This is where Charles Darwin got his dialectic for evolution. Right? So I always thought Hegel was a pretty bad guy, and I don't know if he was a believer or not, but the point is that he was describing something that is pretty obviously real. I mean, we experience this sort of stuff. But as far as a true theory or philosophy of belief regarding spiritual things, it's false. All this stuff is in somebody's head. This is the problem with it. I think the key point about idealism and realism, either one, is that they both emphasize human perception and to the disregard of revelation. Like what does thus saith the Lord? We're not interested in divine revelation. It's human reasoning. And while there are elements of truth in it that we can recognize at the same time, it doesn't lead you anywhere very far. Anselm became famous because he brought up the ontological argument about the existence of God. Well, that's fine, but I would never rely upon the ontological argument for the existence of God for my faith. Let's go to the Bible. Right? Now, realism. There's only one thing you need to put down about idealism that we've seen besides the definition, understanding that basic concept, and that is that it has a misemphasis on human reason or perception. It disregards revelation. Realism. A realist conceives that objects are real in their own right and exist independently of their being known or related to the mind. A realist comes along and says, I believe that God exists. I believe that God is an object that exists regardless of whether I can perceive him or not. And so they're correct. The realists are right. Right? I believe that the idealists are right to a point as well. Schaeffer gave you a definition that realism is the doctrine that the objects of human cognition, the teaching that whatever you see and experience have real existence, objectively.
Whether or not we...
Yeah. If you see something, it's real.
But only if you can see it?
Oh boy. I'm not sure I can explain it. Here we have something here. I should use something real. Real. Okay. Here's a tape. Okay? I think it's a tape. I really think it exists. It's sitting on the desk. Now, a realist says that regardless of whether I recognize what that is or not, regardless of whether I can name that or not, regardless of whether I can explain or interpret that or not, is real. It exists. It exists in its own right. An idealist says, I believe there is such a thing as a tape because I have the concept in my mind. That's pretty weak. Right? But they both have an element of truth in it. Right? A nominalist who is opposed to a realist says the only thing real about that is this. The TAPE. If you can name something, if you can put a name on something, it's real. They say reality depends on whether you can name something. Right? So, that would, for most of us, we would be able. Most of life is unreal because I don't know the name of this or that thing.
Janet reminded me last time I get a
Yeah, any person that you don't know the name of is really unreal.
I can't remember her name, so you're not really there.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that you ignored or didn't put the realism down in your notes in the handout?
I don't remember what was behind that. It's been years since I did that.
But it,
Probably because he put them together. Okay. Let me just give you a couple of descriptive statements. There are two basic concerns for the realist, according to Britannica. First, things are real and distinct in their own right. Things in their own right are real and distinctive. You can classify things. We can classify things into organic and inorganic, physical, metaphysical. Right? You can classify real things because of the inherent distinctions that everything in life reflect. And distinct. And can be classified. That's the point. Everything has its own unique characteristics. Right? The second thing that they stress is that our senses give us knowledge of these things in space and time. Our senses give us knowledge of these real things in space and time. this brings us to a problem. And it shows how that idealism and realism are so interrelated, even though they're distinct. First, the realist says this exists in its own right. This thing right here. This really does exist in its own right. But I'm able to feel this thing. I'm able to experience this thing with my senses. Right? And so the two things go together. That I perceive this with my senses, but it is real even if I don't perceive it with my senses. And the realist acknowledges both things. So there's a point of contact between idealism and realism. The idealist says that something exists whenever you can perceive it, because you can perceive it. Right? The realist says something exists whether or not I perceive it, but I can usually perceive it. I can perceive things that are real.
Are they
So the point is that both of these philosophies of the meaning and existence of life are based upon human rationality, rather than revelation, and that's the problem. As natural theories of reality and existence, they disregard divine revelation, and they lead to all kinds of confusion.
Realism disregards divine revelation as well.
Certainly. Now, I should say that Schaeffer is discussing them under naturalistic, anti-theistic theories. That is, conclusions that people draw. And so a lot of people with these ideas never become believers in God. Although there are people who were believers. For example, Anselm, I'm sure he was a godly man, and he was a believer. But he was the one, he was all involved in the discussion, of the philosophical discussion of these ideas. Right? But as anti-theistic theories, they don't do anything. Let me give you a practical example. I ran into a guy one time who was not a believer, and he was kind of like searching. He's this young guy, and he was searching. And I don't remember if I'm confusing this discussion with something I saw on television or something, but I'll tell it to you anyway. That he says, why should I believe in God? And I said, because nature argues for God's existence, and the Bible teaches that God exists, and I've experienced His existence. And he says, well, how do you know there's a God? You just think there's a God. See, this is idealism. That I believe in God because I have the idea of God in my head. And he's hung up on this idea. This is a very prevalent idea. Right? And then other people say, I won't believe in something unless I can see with my eyes. Right? In a sense, that's realistic. Right? That they demand a point of connection between their senses and something before they will actually really accept it. That's tough stuff. But I hope it's been a little profitable for you. Man, it seems like pulling teeth trying to get through this stuff. I'm not going to take another class on it. We're going to go on.
What's one thing?
What I'll do is, I think you've already got notes on this stuff, don't you? You're supposed to have your own notes, and I gave you a handout on it. And I'll try to
Oh yeah, this here.
type it and hang on it.
So do you want us to?
Pardon?
What do you want us to?
Well, the next reading assignment, just take it and go through it, make notes on it. I'm going to make up a quiz and stuff on this, and I'll give it to you. Help you to
You haven't.
summarize it.